Okay, here we go.
All right. Hello and welcome to our webinar on strengthening legacy cities with Strong Towns founder Charles Marohn. This is the final webinar in a series aimed at discussing strengthening legacy cities and how they can leverage their assets to restore their economic vitality while promoting a socially just and sustainable community. My name is Katie Phillips, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see subtitles during this presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation. And if we do not get to your questions, we do apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at phillips.1870@osu.edu. There will also be a short survey at the end of the webinar, and if you have time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to kick it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
All right, thank you, Katie, and welcome to our webinar today. And as Katie mentioned, this is the third of a series of webinars we had this semester on strengthening legacy cities in Ohio and beyond. In our first two webinars, we talked specifically about some of the post-industrial cities such as Cleveland, Toledo, other places like Youngstown, other places like that that have an industrial legacy. In this third webinar, we're expanding our horizon a bit and talking more generally about how America develops its cities. And for that, we're bringing in an expert in this area, Charles Marohn, or Chuck to his friends and colleagues, who is the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. This is a very clear, accessible, and thought-provoking book, which I really highly recommend. He hosts the Strong Town podcast and is a primary writer for the Strong Town web content at strongtowns.org. And he has presented these Strong Town concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. He is number 10 on Planetizen's list of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time, just behind Le Corbusier and just ahead of Richard Florida.
I always point out there might be a little bit of recency bias there, but it's
just take it, Chuck.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay, Chuck is a professional engineer. He's licensed in the state of Minnesota, and he's a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. And he has bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Chuck grew up on a small farm in central Minnesota. He's the oldest of 3 sons of 2 elementary school teachers and joined the Minnesota National Guard on his 17th birthday during his junior year of high school and served for 9 years. Very, very community-oriented, very pro-social oriented. We can see wants to make contributions. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, which is what he's going to talk about today, he loves playing music. He's an obsessive reader and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. Chuck and his wife live with their 2 daughters in the hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. And with that, Chuck, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's very nice to be able to speak to everybody here. I realize, I've got my Twins glass and I didn't want to trigger anyone from Ohio. I recognize I should have brought my University of Minnesota glass, because if you're a sports buff, that would give my hosts here a little bit more of a feeling of superiority, and I will acknowledge that. But it's nice to chat with all of you. It's always nice to do these in person. I appreciate the technology and the fact that we can do this virtually. I'm happy to have this opportunity to present some ideas to you, and look forward to taking your questions at the end. Just briefly about Strong Towns, our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities to become financially strong and resilient. We deal largely in media, so our way of pursuing our mission is to share our message as broadly as we can. So you will find on our website 2 or 3 new articles every day, 3 different podcast streams, a lot of videos, stuff that is designed to share not just with other academics and other interested people, although that is important, but also I like to say you can share with your mom and she should be able to read it and understand it and like it too. That's the kind of conversation we're trying to have at Strong Towns. I think it's important, and I start my book this way because I think when we look at the 20th century, it's kind of the century of machines and mechanical things and translating life into kind of simple algorithms, so to speak. We often forget, and I think are kind of relearning now the lessons of complex adaptive systems. We can think of a rainforest as kind of the quintessential complex adaptive system. We understand that the rainforest is made up of many different flora and fauna. They all act independently of each other. They're all free to change and adapt and evolve in response to stimulus and stress within their environment. Sometimes, though, we don't quite recognize that cities are actually complex adaptive systems. Cities as human habitat is something that evolved and adapted along with us. It's something that grew from many different individual actors acting independently on stresses and opportunities within their environment to create a pattern of development, a style of living that we can think of as human habitat, a complex adaptive system. Complex adaptive systems are different than systems that are merely complicated. A Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. In fact, the complication is a big part of the novelty. But we understand that if we cut one of these strings or we move one of these blocks, the Rube Goldberg machine doesn't evolve and adapt and become something new. It just breaks. It just stops working. This is the fundamental difference between systems that are complex and adaptive and systems that are merely complicated. If we take a rainforest and we give the rainforest in any season excessive amounts of rain or excessive amounts of sun, we don't expect the rainforest to fail. It will adapt, it will change, it will evolve. Different flora and fauna may become more dominant or less dominant, but the system doesn't fall apart. It has an inner strength to it. If we look at a cornfield, a system that is complicated but not complex, if we give a cornfield too much rain in a season, too much sun in a season, it doesn't evolve and adapt and become soybeans. It doesn't become potatoes. It just stops being corn. It just fails at what it's designed to do. This ability to adapt, this inner strength, this flexibility is one of the major differences between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. When we look back at human habitat throughout history, what we're looking at is a complex adaptive system. When we look at modern development patterns, the way we go out and build things today in this kind of mechanistic way, what we're looking at systems that are intrinsically designed not to adapt, not to change, not to be flexible. And in fact, that's often their selling point, is that there will not be any change in what you buy. These systems are, by their nature, merely complicated. When we look at that human habitat, we look at that complex adaptive environment, what we're seeing is a wisdom essentially developed and nurtured through trial and error by our ancestors. And I use ancestors in the broadest possible sense of the word. People around the world for thousands of years built cities incrementally. This is my hometown. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, where I am today, where I'm from. This is what it looked like in 1870. This is what really every city throughout human history, prior to our kind of post-World War II incarnation of cities, this is what everyone before that would have started like: a series of little pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. And the ones that were successful, which you would have seen as more and more people moving to a place like this, as more and more people move here, as more stuff starts to happen, the land underneath becomes more valuable. That value increase combined with kind of the natural decline and deterioration of these buildings would create a natural redevelopment pressure where people would tear down or add on to these buildings. And over time, you would get something where the development pattern matched the underlying increased land value. Here's the same street roughly 30 years later. These little pop-up shacks are gone. Now you have these 2- and 3-story wood structures. As more and more people would move to this city, as more stuff would happen, as the land underneath here would start to become more and more valuable, again, that natural redevelopment pressure would prompt this street to 40 years later become this street here. Buildings now of brick and granite. This is how cities have grown for thousands of years, this incremental pattern of growing up, growing out, and becoming more intense over time. You can think of a culture growing in a petri dish. It's this incremental process of kind of building on past successes to become, in a city's case, wealthier, thicker, more prosperous, certainly, stronger over time. After World War II, we changed this pattern. Really, we began to change this pattern in the early 1900s. The Great Depression and World War II were accelerators in that process. When we got to the end of World War II, we had a completely new development pattern. We started to grow in a hyper out way. This same exact street now today looks like this. It is a wasteland of half-occupied buildings and parking lots. And I show this image. I love my city. I love this place. I want it to be successful. I show this image, and I think it's important because in one snapshot here, you're capturing the financial struggle of American cities. There's $500,000 of public infrastructure, and just that couple little blocks shown right there. Where is the wealth that is going to allow the city to sustain that $500,000 of investment? Where is the wealth that we can tap into that we can use then to go back and fix that road, that street, that sidewalk, those lights, the pipes under the road, the stormwater systems? That wealth used to be there. It is no longer there. This is the biggest change, in terms of finance and the viability of our cities that we made following World War II. And I think it's important to pause and understand the very natural kind of human things that got us to make such a radical change in our development pattern. If you look at the Great Depression, you're looking at a period of time that people didn't understand why the economy no longer worked. In fact, we look back in history, and our economists tell us today many, many different narratives of what caused the Great Depression. You'll have one economist suggest it was this. You'll have another economist suggest it was this. They both sound very plausible. They're opposite narratives. No one really knew what caused the Depression. Even more importantly, no one understood how to get out of the Great Depression. The New Deal project in itself was a bunch of different attempts to kind of throw things at the wall and see what stick. Let's try to get things moving. The only thing that got us back to something that looked like full employment and economic growth was, of course, World War II. No one would really call World War II prosperity. Not only did you have rationing, but you literally had millions of working age people drafted into service, sent overseas to kill and to die. And the remainder back home drafted into building the implements of war, ships, planes, munitions, tanks, all that stuff. When we got done with World War II, when it became clear we were going to win towards the end, the economists here started to freak out because they looked at the economy and they said, you know what, when we demobilize millions of troops, when we shut down all these industries of war, there's nothing fundamentally different about our economy that's going to keep us from sliding right back into depression. This quote on the screen that I've had here for a while, were the war to end suddenly, there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced. This was uttered by Paul Samuelson, one of FDR's senior economic advisors. They were convinced that once the war shut down, we were going to go right back to the depths of depression. Of course, that's not what happened. We understand in hindsight that they were wrong. What happened was we, a nation united against common enemies, a nation united kind of behind single purposes, took that social cohesion, took the fact that we were the only country not decimated by war, the only major industrial power left standing. We had the world's reserve currency. We had literally the gold. We had abundant oil reserves in our country. We were the world's largest oil producing nation at this point. We took all of these resources we had and we said, you know what we're going to do? We are going to reshape an entire continent around a new theory of how we should live. And we are going to do this as a way to not only prevent us from going back into depression, but we're going to do this as a way to create prosperity for all. we're going to try to create a more prosperous America, give everyone a little piece of the pie. And, I think even looking back, we can be cynical because there were obviously lots of people left out of what everybody was. But I think, even the people finally attuned to this thought, if we get the ball rolling, we will be able to raise all boats and make a prosperous country for everyone. And so we built this new version of America. We transformed a continent within a generation, throwing away thousands and thousands of years of how to build cities around a new set of approaches. And here's the amazing thing. It worked, right? We look back today at this period of time right after World War II as this kind of nostalgic age of America, like peak US. This was when, a single blue collar worker could support a family in their own suburban house with multiple cars. You had all this like civic involvement. You have the kind of Ozzie and Harriet vision of America. This is a time period we nostalgize because of its broad prosperity. I want to show you what this looks like on a map, because what we did is we took this complex adaptive system of a city and we turned it into a kinetic growth machine. We turned it into a machine that could generate over and over and over again economic growth. This is Fresno, California. I use Fresno because we have really good maps of Fresno, but we could look at really any city in North America that grew after World War II and see the same kind of pattern. This is the city limits of Fresno in 1897, and I watch how it changes over time. 1909, you're looking here, 1922, this incremental development pattern, city growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and becoming incrementally more intense. And now, the end of World War II, the kinetic growth machine kicks in. We have a new pattern of development. We're going to transform this continent within a very short period of time. And here's what you see. You start to see this very aggressive out pattern, this very aggressive horizontal expansion. We are creating lots of growth, lots of jobs, and lots of economic activity. With those as our main measuring sticks. And you can see this today, even in the way we talk about a pending infrastructure bill as being a job stimulus, a growth creation mechanism, a way to get the economy moving. Whenever you listen to an economist talk, we have a drinking game at Strong Downs where it's like, how many seconds will it take them to say we should invest in infrastructure? There's a direct tie in this development pattern, in this kinetic growth machine, between adding new pipes, adding new roads, adding new stuff, and getting economic growth and development. This is a pattern that we developed in response to the Great Depression. And grow it does. We can create lots of growth very, very quickly. This is data from Lafayette, Louisiana. At the end of World War II, Lafayette had a population of a little over 33,000. Today, it's over 120,000. It's a 3.5 times amount of growth. It's a huge amount of growth in a very short period of time. But when we look at Lafayette, we dig a little bit deeper, we start to see some things that are related to this. At the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water service to the people of Lafayette, Louisiana. Today, it takes 10 times that. It takes 50 feet of pipe per person to provide water. If we look at something like fire protection and we say, what did it take to keep the people of Lafayette safe? At the end of World War II, it was 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it's 21 times that. And so when you look at a city like Lafayette, which is very, very similar data to what we're going to see in other places across North America, you see a population that grew very, very quickly, but you see the underlying liabilities, the commitments of the local government, the commitments of the community, you see those growing even faster. This makes some sense. And I think kind of intuitively, as Americans, we accept this trade-off because we believe ourselves to be much more prosperous. When we look back, we say, well, yes, today we have larger houses and larger lots and larger vehicles, and we are, by measurements of economic growth, much more prosperous and much better off. But when we actually step back and look at what it means at the family level, what we see is that while this pattern has been able to create lots of growth, we grow our liabilities even faster. But when we look at our families are just not keeping up. We can grow our liabilities 10x and 20x, but we're only growing our wealth by a tiny fraction of that. Our cities today are full of families and full of small businesses that have lower net worths, extremely higher amounts of debt, and very limited savings compared to people of the past, even people that we would consider very poor. I want to show you the mechanism here because it's a little bit sneaky and it kind of hides in plain sight in our cities. These are two identical lots in my hometown. The one on the left, we call the old and blighted lot. The one on the right, we call shiny and new. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks here. So what you're looking at is in the 1920s, the far distant edge of the city. They were developed in the way that that block on the left is developed. Little pop-up shacks, very similar to what you saw in that photo from 1870s that I showed you of the original city. Had things progressed as they had in normal times, people who built these properties, who owned them, would have expected there to be ultimately second and third stories. As the neighborhood grew, as the neighborhood matured, as the city continued to expand, as more people moved, the land would become more valuable. You'd have this natural redevelopment pressure, and you would get that development intensity that we saw for not only the center of my community, but for cities across the world for thousands of years. Of course, that's not what happened. These were built in the 1920s. Then you had the Great Depression. Then you had World War II. Now you have the kinetic growth machine. You have this new pattern of development that just skips right over these properties and starts building out on the edge. These 3 blocks that you see here, the 2 I'm highlighting, the one in between, have stagnated for almost a century. The one on the right used to look just like the one on the left. It was a little collection of pop-up shacks. The city labeled it blight, got it torn down, and now we have Taco John's. I'm not sure if you have Taco John's in Ohio. I don't think that you do. Taco John's you can think of as like Norwegian Mexican food. So, tater tots with lots of salt and dipped in kind of mild cheddar cheese. That's the way we roll. If you ever get a little bit further west from where you're at, you'll run into Taco John's. Everybody was happy to get this development, right? We got rid of blight. We got something that met our building codes, met our fire codes, met our zoning codes, got plenty of parking, got a little bit of green space. When we go down the checklist, that kinetic growth checklist of all the things we want to see in new developments, this one met all of that. It met the bank financing requirements. It met the secondary market requirements. This is a very securitizable type of investment style. And so in terms of every player in this transaction, from the city and the public to the investor to the insurance agents and the bond purchasers and all that, this is a great investment. Here's what nobody bothered to look at. That old blighted rundown block has a total value of 1.1 million. You add up all those individual properties, you get a value of 1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, the same long-term expense to the community to provide ongoing service and maintenance, has a value of only $600,000. The city actually collects, there's actually 78% more wealth in that block on the left than there is in the block on the right. There's more employees, there's more local owners, there's more rote transactions, there's more wages being paid. However you measure the success, the block on the left, even in its rundown, dilapidated, neglected state, vastly outperforms the block on the right, shiny and new. This is a compelling example. It kind of shows you what's going on, but this is by no means cherry-picked. This is a trend and a pattern that we see repeated over and over and over in cities all over North America. What I'm going to show you now is a series of maps put together by a group out of Asheville, North Carolina called Urban 3. They are collaborators of ours. They do very interesting work. If you think of a farmer going and spreading seed across a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that is the most productive parts of the field. That's where you get the most bushels per acre, for example. When we look at a city, where are the most productive parts of the city? Where do we have the highest value per acre? Where are we getting the most productivity? This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York has a I think even to greater extents than a city like Cleveland has experienced decline post-World War II. Buffalo has been hollowed out. It's experienced broad disinvestment. They have lost population every single year since the end of the war, including last year. So it's been this kind of steady downward decline. Now, I happen to really like Buffalo. I think it's a great place. But you go back 100 years ago and it was still one of America's great cities. Today, despite the decline, we can look and ask the question, where is the wealth in Buffalo? Where is the productivity? What you're looking at here is financial productivity, that value per acre. Where are we getting the most return on that investment? And what you see is that the core downtown, the core walkable parts of the community, that part that was built in the complex adaptive framework before the Great Depression, still, despite the decline, despite the neglect, has immense value that outperforms, literally everything that we've built subsequently. This is a pattern, like I said, we see repeated in city after city after city. It doesn't matter if the city is large or small or mid-sized. It doesn't matter if the city is on the East Coast or the West Coast, or if it's in the middle of the country. It doesn't matter if the city is cold weather or warm, north or south. It doesn't matter if these neighborhoods are occupied by the poorest people in the community or the wealthiest people in the community. What we see time and time again is that pre-Great Depression development pattern, that complex adaptive environment, financially outperforms everything that we have built subsequent. After World War II, the productivity just starts to fall. And every decade of development afterwards, the costs go up and the return goes down. The further you go out in time, the more that disparity becomes. This map is a map of Lafayette, Louisiana. I gave you some data earlier on Lafayette. This map looks the same as the productivity maps, but it is slightly different. In those maps, we're looking at where is the wealth in the community. In this map, we've actually gone to the next step and said, where does the city receive their revenue? And where does the city spend their money? And how do those two relate? And so what you're looking at is, in a sense, a profit and loss map of the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. Every place where you see a blue parcel, you're seeing a parcel that pays more annually or contributes more annually in taxes and fees to the city than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. Every place you see red, it's the exact opposite. These are places that cost more to provide ongoing service and maintenance than they bring in revenue. The higher the line goes, the more the disparity is. So what are we looking at here? In the middle, you kind of understand that's the core downtown, right? That's the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. It is profitable for them as a community. On the to the right of that, to the east of that, there's a crescent of blue that runs through there. That crescent of blue are some of the poorest neighborhoods of the community. Here's a couple of photos. The top one is the downtown. As you can see, I like Lafayette. They're very nice people. They work very hard. They are working on improving their downtown, but from an eye test, this does not look like a prosperous place, right? It still struggles. They still have a lot of vacancy problems. They still have a lot of issues they're working through. Financially, on paper, they're doing fantastic. They're producing way more revenue than they have costs. That bottom picture, that is one of those poor neighborhoods in that blue area. Obviously, when we look at that, it does not pass the eye test. It looks not productive. It looks like it would not be a great neighborhood. In many ways, this neighborhood does struggle, but from a city standpoint, from the community standpoint, it is a net contributor of tax revenue. It's a net contributor of fees. It costs less to provide service to than it pays in on an annual basis, despite the poverty, despite the decline. Some people have asked me, well, Chuck, is that just because they're not taking care of things? No, our model, the data that we use actually assumes that the city will go out and fix the street. We'll maintain these lights. We'll maintain the stormwater drainage. We'll fix all the pipes. The fact that they're not doing that only makes the disparity larger. It only makes the disparity greater. These neighborhoods on the right are contributors, net contributors to the overall city coffers. On the other side of the ledger, then, the places that cost more than they are paying, costs more to serve than they are paying in taxes and fees. That's all the stuff out on the edge. That's the big box stores, the malls, the strip malls, the franchise drive-through restaurants, the gas stations, the windy cul-de-sac places, that's all that stuff out on the edge. If you are the city of Lafayette, if you are a resident in the city of Lafayette, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. That's $1,500 in taxes to the city. There's other taxes you would pay to the parish, the school district, what have you, but $1,500 to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that's been built, maintain all the roads and the pipes and the sidewalks, and provide all the police protection, fire protection, transit service, everything that they have kind of committed themselves to doing, median taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 that a family in Lafayette makes would need to get sent back to the city just to maintain what's already been built. That's not going to happen. That can never happen. It's not a workable number. And so at some point in the future, and in fact, the city's already well into this, Lafayette is going to have to make a decision on what road do we fix? What road do we let fall apart? What pipe do we repair? What pipe do we not repair? What neighborhood do we keep? What neighborhood do we walk away from? If this sounds like a city that you're familiar with, it should. If this sounds a lot like Detroit, it should sound like Detroit. As we like to explain, and as I talk about in my book, Detroit is just the early adopter of this development pattern. Detroit is literally the pioneer of the American pattern of development. They began as the Motor City experimenting with this approach, this hyper out, complicated kinetic growth machine approach to building. They experimented with it before everybody else did. And when we reached the end of World War II, what mayors and city council members and chambers of commerce and really leaders all across North America did is they copied the development pattern pioneered by one of our most successful cities, that being Detroit. And so we are all, in a sense, following in Detroit's footsteps. Our development pattern, the productivity of our development pattern, the cash flow of our development pattern, mimics that of Detroit. Detroit's just 2 or 3 decades ahead of everybody else. I want to close, and we're going to get to questions here in a few minutes. I want to give you some kind of core strong towns responses to this, because the idea of suggesting that we're all following in Detroit's footsteps, it can be a very depressing thing. And I think understanding that machines break. As an engineer, this is kind of, engineering 101, all machines break. When you treat systems like machines, what you're doing is you're using duct tape and twine and barbed wire to try to keep that machine working, right? Like everything you got to keep that machine going, but eventually it's going to fall apart and break. When I step back and I look at our economy and I look at things like massive stimulus bills and infrastructure bills and debt forgiveness and lowering interest rates so we can take on more debt and all the things that we do, to me, it feels like that duct tape and barbed wire and baler twine to kind of keep it all running, this machine running. When you recognize that, and you also get to the point where you say, in order for cities to endure, in order for cities to be successful, in order for cities, our human habitat, to respond to us, they need to adapt and evolve and change. You can start to entertain a whole set of ideas that we promote at Strong Towns. I'm going to go through a handful of those right now. The first one is very simple. We need to allow our neighborhoods to breathe. We need to allow that change to happen. You can't keep a neighborhood locked under glass and expect it to survive. It will eventually break. When we treat it like a machine, we have to treat it like a living organism that can grow and adapt. And that means that we have to allow everywhere the next increment of a development intensity by right. There's a couple of little technical terms in there. Let me say this in layman's terms. Every neighborhood should be allowed, every building should be allowed to add on and have like the next unit of intensity, and they should be able to do that without any regulatory friction. You go in at 9 a.m. with a completed permit application, and you walk out at noon with your permit to go ahead. If you want to turn that single family home into a duplex, there should be no real obstacles to that happening. That is thickening up. That's the way that neighborhoods evolve and adapt. We have a saying at Strong Towns, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood should be exempt from change. We have to allow our neighborhoods to breathe, to grow, to evolve and adapt to better serve us and our changing needs. We can't have regulations, restrictions, financing, everything that locks a neighborhood in place and doesn't allow it to change. Along with this, we need to very actively go out and lower the bar of entry. We need to make the systems that we have created more broadly accessible to people so that people do have the capacity to start with nothing and end up with something. For all kinds of good, compassionate reasons, we have actually raised the entry fee to participate in society. And we need to lower that ante so that more people can be part of creating our places and making them successful. Let me give you a couple examples of what I mean by lowering the bar of entry. This is something in my hometown that we call a tiny house. If you want to build a tiny house, you have to go to the city council, get permission. You've got to meet all the requirements of a regular house plus subpart A through M of the tiny house provisions. You have to petition the planning commission. You have to talk to your neighbors and get their okay. You've got a public hearing. You've got a permission by the city council. It's this long drawn out process. We call this a tiny house. My ancestors, the people who lived here generations ago, would have called this a house. This is really just a starter house. It's just a smaller version of a house. It has kitchen, it has bedrooms, it has living space. A small house is the way families historically have gotten started. They built something small. When they saved up enough money, they would put on an addition. When they had a kid, they'd put on a second story. The neighbor would come over and help. They would come over and help them. We have taken this product out of the marketplace and we made it somehow weird and mysterious and not financeable and not permittable. This is just a starter house. We need to make these like broadly available again as an option in the marketplace. We've also have this example from Muskegon, Michigan. This is one of my favorites. In Muskegon, they had a downtown that was struggling to attract tenants, people struggling to afford to get into the vacant buildings they had. And not because the building rent was high, but because the cost of entry was very high. If you wanted to get into a building, you had to put in a sprinkler system, you had to put in ADA compliant bathrooms, you had to do all kinds of things that we want done, but were too much for people who were at the startup phase of entrepreneurship. So what Muskegon did is they went out and they said, okay, they put it out these storage sheds, they painted them up kind of funky colors, and they rent them out very, very cheaply to startup entrepreneurs. People who are trying to figure out what can I do that would be of service to my neighbors that allows me to make a living. The fascinating thing is that downtown Muskegon, those shops are now full. And a lot of the people that are in those shops in the downtown are people who got proof of concept and tried things out here in a very low risk startup kind of way and have been able to graduate into those more mature spaces. This is lowering the bar of entry. We need to respond to how people use the city. We have built these places designed around growth. How do we create kinetic growth? How do we get the next unit of GDP? How do we turn our cities into machines that generate this top line growth? If we want them to be adaptable, if we want them to work for humans, we have to actually go back and ask the question, where are these cities not working for the people who are here? At Strong Towns, we've created a 4-step process to do this. And we believe that this should replace the capital improvements processes that most cities go through. The 4 questions the 4-step process is very easy. It starts with first, a humble observation of where people in the community struggle. We go out and we walk with people, we observe, we try to understand where people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built. We then ask the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the federal grant we can get to fix this for all time, not what is the big project we can do to take care of this problem once and for all. The idea is like, what can we in a hack kind of way do right now, like immediately with the stuff we've got on hand to make this problem a little bit easier for people. The third step then is to do that thing. Just go do it right now. It's a little tiny thing. You don't need committees. You don't need public hearings. You don't need, long review processes. Just go out and do it. And then the fourth step is to repeat this process. And by repeating the process, you're allowing that humble observation to drive what the next step is and what the next step is and what the next step is. Jane Jacobs called cities a co-creation, something we build together. And what we're really getting back to when we're trying to drive value, when we're trying to create productivity, when we're trying to make our cities financially solvent and productive, what we're talking about is allowing the humans that live there to drive the next level investment by their actions. We can continue on this route. And I spoke at another OSU a few years ago in Oklahoma, and I had this conversation with them. I'll share it with you today. I really like Lawton. Again, very nice people trying to do good work. But Lawton had the idea that there was a federal grant to do streetscape projects. And boy, they've seen other cities do really well with streetscape projects. So if they could just get that federal money and build their streetscape project, their city would be really successful. And that's what they did. They went out and they got the money and they went and built the streetscape project, and nothing has happened, or nothing productive has happened. Nothing that is going to make their people better off and more prosperous. They got the street lights, they got the fancy sidewalks, they got the nice new pavement, but they didn't start with where people struggled. They didn't start with the next smallest thing and work up from there. A city that did, and city that continues to, and I think is one of the greatest examples of how we build strong towns, is Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee has embarked on, in some ways out of necessity, but I think also in just, sheer being very smart and savvy kind of people, have embarked on a lot of these neighborhood scale improvements, where they go out and they do humbly observe where people struggle. And they say, what is the thing we can do with a bucket of paint right now and a couple brooms to make this place a little bit better? This is Broad Avenue, a couple little blocks of a former streetcar stop, run down, neglected, underutilized. They went out and did just a little bit of stuff to try to address where people are struggling, and have seen tremendous returns from this. Not only has this couple block area become a very active place for business development and business creation, but it has spawned throughout this neighborhood, which really, this is a center node of this broader neighborhood, a renaissance in itself, one that has returned many, many, many times what the public investment was on this project. If we look at our cities today, what we see is that they're struggling to be viable. They're breaking under this kinetic growth machine. And if we can humble ourselves to observe where people are struggling, we can discipline ourselves to take these incremental steps to lower the bar of entry, get more people involved, and really work at the scale of where people are in our communities. We can step out of this kinetic growth machine and we can start to create this really exciting set of feedback loops that will make our places, once again, complex and adaptive, make them once again strong. And when we do this, not only are we going to find that we are building wealth within our communities, that we are making low risk, low cost, high returning public investments, but we will find that we are making people's lives better in the process. And that is the essence of the Strong Towns approach. Our website is strongtowns.org. If this presentation interests you, you will find a lot more stuff like this every day on our website. We welcome you to go there and be an ongoing part of our conversation. And I am going to stop and take questions. So Harvey, I don't know if you want to pick these or if you want me to, but I'm willing to, I would love to defer to you to take that.
I'm actually going to let Katie Katie read some of these questions, I want to ask you a couple questions just to kick off really quickly, just
Go for it.
for myself, taking
Yeah.
The MC kind of
The
prerogative
liberty,
here,
right?
the liberty.
Right. Yeah.
So I'd like you to drill down a little more into this idea that inner city neighborhoods are more productive than suburban neighborhoods. And this kind of turns our view of cities on its head. We have a view that suburbs are generating the wealth and that inner city neighborhoods can be a drag.
Yeah.
Can you drill down into that a little bit for us? Is it just a matter of geometry that suburban stuff is more spread out, more expensive compared to the city center, or what is it exactly?
Wow. I think there's two ways to answer that question, and one is deeply technical and one is not. Let me go quickly through the deeply technical one, and then we'll finish with the other. It's important to understand from an accounting standpoint that there's a vast difference between cash flow and wealth creation. We can always make our business cash flow if we're willing to borrow a lot of money, take on a lot of liabilities. This is the old, you and I are old enough to remember Popeye. I know a lot of younger people don't, but there was this character in Popeye named Wimpy, and he would say, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." If we build an economic model on that, we can get a lot of hamburgers today, but we're promising a lot of things on Tuesday. When you look at cities, what we look at in those core neighborhoods are places that are not necessarily generating a lot of free cash flow, but they also don't have a lot of liability per unit. When we go out on the edge, because that stuff oftentimes is relatively new and the liability hasn't come due, we haven't had to fix that street, we haven't had to fix that pipe yet, it's generating a lot of free cash flow. And so it almost feels like it's richer, like it's wealthier because it's generating that free cash flow. But what we haven't fully accounted for is what that long-term liability is. It's a little bit of a difference if you're an accountant between accrual accounting and cash accounting. Cities operate on a cash accounting basis, and so they don't really look at their liabilities. They don't really account for them on an ongoing basis. So we can take over that mile of road and we're like, yeah, we got a free road and we get all this tax base that comes with it. Well, it's never a free road. It's an obligation that's going to come due in 30 years. I think one of the ways to think about, because in my book, I call it spooky wisdom. And I think in the complex adaptive environment, this is a way to think about like the core neighborhoods. People, when they built those, they evolved a way of building that would endure in good times and bad, in peace and prosperity, in times of conflict. And so in a sense, they had to build them in a way that would endure. And that wisdom is embedded in that. And you can pull out, and this is why I show all the different cities, because it's not like you can point to one or two things and say, this is what it is. It is really this kind of culmination of this complex adaptive bottom-up approach. I'll give you one snapshot. If you look at a 1950s ranch home, what you're looking at is something that is very broad and shallow. If you look at a 1950s ranch lot, they tend to be very wide and very shallow. If you take that house and you turn it on its side and you put it in an urban neighborhood lot, you have a standard shotgun shack. You have a standard lot. You have a standard, house of that period of time, skinny and deep. Well, think about just maintaining the road. If you build a bunch of houses skinny and deep, there's a lot more people there to share the burden of maintaining that street, whether that is a burden of everyone going out with a rake or whether that's a burden of everyone paying taxes and contributing your share. As soon as you take that house and you turn it into the 1950s ranch house and just move it sideways, you have the same exact house dimension wise, but you have way more infrastructure per house. Now just keep doing that and houses getting bigger and broader and more spread out and further out with more pumps and more all this stuff to do it. The costs just accelerate as you go out.
I want to follow up with a question about, and it relates to what you just said about maintaining a street and things like that. I want to talk about the role of like top-down initiatives versus this bottom-up approach that you're talking about. So for example, in Columbus, we're moving towards trying to create transit-oriented development in something called the Link Us Corridors project. So we're trying to concentrate development and public transit infrastructure along 5 corridors heading out from downtown. How does it, and relate to that, we have a Vision Zero initiative here, and we're trying to like create things like complete streets and things like that. Those to me seem to be necessary top-down interventions. So how does that fit into your bottom-up model?
Yeah, it's really, it's a good question, and it's very hard. Um, I like to point out that every single kind of top-down initiative that we struggle with today, whether it's the way the interstates were built, or it's the way we've chosen to make housing into a financial product that has really created unaffordability problems, all of these things stem from good intentions of making the system work better. I recognize that we are not going to, because of who we are and where we sit and the way we finance things, get rid of top-down initiatives, by fiat. If you made me choose a world where everything was at the block level and built up from there versus everything was top-down, I would choose the former. It's going to be a blend in reality. I think the way we should think about these top-down initiatives, though, especially the Lincus corridor, I think Vision Zero as well, is that if we allow them to be siloed projects, if we allow them to be projects where we begin and end in a particular silo, say the transportation silo, and we gauge success of this project based on how well that transportation silo performs, we're going to be missing and actually crowding out all of the things that need to happen to make it successful. Transit-oriented development requires a place. We often say we shouldn't do transit-oriented development. We should do development-oriented transit, because we should really start with the development and the place and then connect the place. The funding model says build the transit and then they will come. Okay. If you don't spend 10 times the amount of time on building the place that you actually spend on the transit, and by building the place, I mean going out and humbly observing where people struggle, finding the way to thicken up their neighborhood, help those single family homes turn into duplexes over time, help build wealth in those places, help to create entrepreneurship opportunities there, make it so the people who live in that neighborhood can easily walk to and get to and take a bus to the transit stop to get it, the transit corridor. If you're not spending 10 times the amount of effort doing that humble work in the neighborhood, your big top-down model is going to underperform, and it's going to underperform in a big way, and in a way that is going to kill the initiative for the next one you want to do.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it over to Katie now, and she's going to field some questions from the audience.
So we have a ton of great questions from the audience, and I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them today, but one that keeps popping up over and over again is, does our property tax system impede affordable, sustainable development?
Well, yes. I mean, I think in general, the answer is yes, to a degree. Understand what the property tax does. The property tax punishes people who invest in their property. It punishes them by raising their taxes and requiring more from them. When you look at our cities today, I think one of the best ways to think of it is that they're emaciated. They're denuded of, if they were a human body, they would be denuded of muscle mass. We need to actually build muscle mass in our cities. We need to thicken up, make them stronger. So what we want is a tax system that would actually reward people who make investments in building wealth. And if we want to talk about the opposite of reward, like a punishment, let's say, properties that sit idle and unproductive, empty lots that are used just for parking, homes that are left vacant, businesses that are underutilized, we would want them to actually pay more taxes. If I could, I would have, in every city I worked in, a land tax replace the property tax. I would use things like sales taxes and income taxes for more discretionary items, but I would base my large infrastructure, capital investments, maintenance of core systems and all that on a tax directly tied to the value of the underlying land. And what that would do is it would say the land that has the vacant lot and the land that has the duplex and the land that has the whatever business on it, if it's the same land worth the same amount of money, they're going to pay the same taxes. And so go ahead and take that vacant lot and make it better. Go ahead and take that house and make it better. Go ahead and take that business and make it better. When you make it better, it's going to make the land values go up, but it's going to be a neighborhood land value going up, not individual properties land values going up. So study the land tax. The one thing about the land tax is that the people who love it think it will cure cancer and solve Mideast peace, and they get a little too overboard on it. But if you just go, I mean, you go to Strong Towns-land tax or land value tax, or you just do a search for land value tax, you're going to get a lot of information that will kind of make you want to switch from the property tax to something else.
Going along with this land value tax that we're talking about, we have a question about property owners who are speculating if they hold on to their vacant or abandoned parcels, then maybe they'll get the right price later. Do you think something like a land value tax would be a good solution to get these underutilized parcels back into use?
Yes, and I actually think that would be the best thing that you could do. There are some other strategies that go along with that. But I think it's important to understand when we're talking about land speculators, when we're talking about slumlords, we're talking about kind of the negative financial things that go along with blight. What you're really talking about is a viable financial strategy for an investor. If I can invest right now, if I have $1 million to invest and I can go out and put that in a bank account, we all know what I'm going to get. I'm going to get nothing. I'm going to get very little. If I can go out and buy an empty lot in a neighborhood, even a struggling neighborhood that I think has a chance to maybe do something at some point, if I can get 2%, 3%, 4% appreciation a year, I'm doing great. Well, really, in most cities, especially now that we seem to be entering this inflationary environment, I'm getting way more than that. I'm getting 10%. I'm getting 15%. Now, I'm not getting it in cash. I'm getting it on my balance sheet, but that also is good because I don't have to realize that. I don't have to pay capital gains on it. I've got other options. Real estate is given a lot of flexible financing types of things. So I can finance it in funky ways. I can roll over my gains so I don't have to pay taxes on them immediately. We've created a huge incentive for people to invest in land and hold it and keep it unproductive. And at the local level, the more we can switch to things like the land tax, require that these properties be well maintained. So use our police powers to go out and say, you got to mow the grass, you got to keep the roof up, you can't board up the windows, you got to keep this nice. The more we can, require higher standards, the more we're going to keep moving this along. On the other side, we got to make it easy for them to do that. We can't put them through 6 months of permitting to build a small house on a property.
We're getting quite a few questions on zoning and building regulations. Basically, the gist is, what should we be doing to improve that?
If I were going to answer that very quickly, I would say we have to make sure that the next iteration of intensity, and I describe that most easily as single family home to duplex, single family home to single family home with accessory apartment, 1 unit commercial building to 2 unit commercial building. That has to be as frictionless as possible. And that freaks out our permitting people because they're like, oh my gosh, duplexes, it'll be chaos. There's only so much chaos you can create with thickening up incrementally. And so I think, our permitting process right now treats everything like it's a massive development going in. I think we need to say, okay, we'll keep that for the massive development, but we're going to create this kind of frictionless process to thicken up. And if we can do that, we would solve a lot, or we would get ourselves on that positive feedback loop, solving a lot of problems.
One more question, Katie?
I will just let you know, Katie, that I'm willing to, I know we got time limits. I can stay a little longer if need be, but also would be happy if you want to screenshot or capture these questions. I can try to answer them offline too, to the extent. So I don't want to leave people hanging.
That is very nice of you.
We can take just a few more minutes for a couple more questions. That'd
Okay.
be good. If people want to leave, they can.
We're getting questions about addressing opportunity zones in regards to taxes and investments.
I think opportunity zones was a very poorly conceived top-down initiative. The idea was, let's take rich people's capital and put it to work in poor neighborhoods. And, like in theory, this sounds really great. Here's the reality. What poor neighborhoods need is not to be have a fire hose of capital thrown on them. That tends to result in displacement. It tends to result in neighborhoods people not being able to stay in their own neighborhood. What we find is that poor neighborhoods have a lot of capital. They have a ton of social capital. They have a lot of entrepreneurial people. They have a lot of hardworking people. They just have people that have kind of been sidelined by the system. And if we can look at those places for the wealth and the value that they are, free them up, they have everything they need to start building success, to start building wealth. I think that opportunity zones is kind of a front row, to use Chris Arnott, who wrote the book Dignity, to use his term. I think it's a very kind of comfortable thing that elite people would like to think is helping, and it's really not. It's not humble.
But if I can follow up on that really quickly, if you don't mind, Katie, is it just a matter of freeing up the entrepreneur spirit in these neighborhoods? I mean, there's a legacy of like redlining and historical structural racism and things like that have isolated neighborhoods and people.
Yes.
Please.
I wrote an article about redlining in Kansas City, and it actually, I would refer people to it because it contained in it basically a plan for Kansas City to put capital into a neighborhood. But what you will see is that it is a plan that starts where people in the neighborhood are and seeks to assist them directly, as opposed to having the theory be outside capital would come in and start building Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and strip malls and condo units and that kind of thing, which is what we've actually seen with opportunity zones for the most part. Wall Street capital is an insane casino game right now today. And I don't say that to be just pejorative, but I mean, you look and people on Wall Street don't understand what's going on Wall Street. They're like, these valuations don't make sense. There's money sloshing around. A zero interest rate environment, we don't even know how to price that in. Zero interest rates basically means the cost of capital is free. If you have like to point out, if you have a zero interest rate bond, for 30 years, you don't have to pay anything back for 30 years. That you have no cost of holding that capital. That's an insane world, and people don't know how to deal with that. And so what you're seeing is all kinds of crazy things happening. I think opportunity zones takes that craziness and brings it into a struggling neighborhood. And I actually think we need to shield struggling neighborhoods from craziness and allow them to. The poor neighborhoods that I've seen do the best are the ones where they start with the people who are there and back them, as opposed to try to replace them with smarter, better, more capitalized people.
Maybe one more question now. We're starting to lose people. Katie?
Do you want to end on a funny note or on a more serious note?
Is it the question about his favorite Minnesota Twins player?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, give me the funny, give me the serious one first, because I can answer that one easily.
Okay. There's so many. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Do you favor saving our historic building inventory as a way of building stronger towns?
Yes, with caveats. For the most part, we tend to be very cavalier about throwing away good buildings. We tend to look at them, and the architect will come in, or the construction guy will come in and say, it's more expensive to salvage this and reuse it than it is to just tear down and build new. Let's tear down and build new. And I have seen that not be true again and again and again. there's a little city in Mississippi called Water Valley. It's been written about a lot, and it's been written about a lot because they've done some astounding things. I stood in a building in Water Valley that I didn't even know how it was standing. The roof was caved in, the floors were caved in, the wall, and they were rebuilding it. And I went back years later, and it's built, and it's amazing. They saved the building, and they salvaged it. I think that we are way too cavalier about throwing away old good buildings. And I think we should always start with the idea of how do we take what's here and again, what's the next step of making some use of this? That being said, I do struggle sometimes with the historic preservation movement or mindset. And the tension is that I think a lot of times, particularly when we get into more affluent historic preservation kind of mindsets, the idea is we want to lock this neighborhood in amber. We want to freeze it in amber. We want to put it under glass so it will never change. And that, that 1920s craftsman or that, that very nondescript house, it's historic now and it can't change. And the reality is you can go to, I spent a lot of time in Southern Italy. Southern Italy is a very poor part of Italy, but it's also a very old historic part of Italy. And the amazing thing about Southern Italy is how historic and gorgeous it is by capturing that kind of ancient way of building, but yet how modern it still is and how people were still finding ways to make use of those buildings and modify them and transform them to serve our needs today. I think when historic preservation is used to value existing buildings and build off of that success, awesome. When it's used as a tool of kind of resistance of all change, then we start to get a little problematic. My favorite twin.
Yes, your favorite twin.
I don't know if this is modern or all time, but my favorite twin of all time is Kirby Puckett. It's impossible to be 47 and have watched the 87 and 91 World Series and not like idolize Kirby Puckett in so many ways. My favorite modern twin is Byron Buxton. We have this legacy of great center fielders, Torrey Hunter, and now Byron Buxton, and he's under contract for 2 more years and they're negotiating an extension with him. And I hope it works out because he is one exciting player. I feel some empathy for Cleveland Indian fans. I know that's probably the closest to you. Is that true?
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati. Yeah, Cincinnati, we kind of, because we don't have to fight with them, but Cleveland's in our division and it's going to be interesting because Cleveland is going through what we went through a while ago, which is they're a good team, but now they're having these payroll challenges and their winning window is closing, it feels like. And how do they get that back? And I'm empathetic, but I'll still cheer for the Twins against you.
Hey, well, Chuck, thanks for a really great talk.
Hey,
great
thank you.
Discussion. We'll have to have you back to talk about maybe some follow-up and also maybe have you back just for a special baseball show. We can talk about baseball for an hour.
Man, baseball is my passion. Send me the questions and I will see if I can do a podcast and try to answer some of those.
Okay, yeah. I was able to capture them.
Excellent. Send them over to me.
Okay, thanks for joining us today, everyone. I recommend strongtowns.org very much. As Chuck says, every day there's something new there and something interesting to look at. Also, this ends our Spring 21 event series, but we continue. So as always, check us out at cura.osu.edu. Also Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us there. We always have exciting events happening in Cura and fantastic guests like Chuck. So keep in touch, and everyone take care. Enjoy the warm weather and stay healthy.
Thank you. Take care,
Bye,
everybody.
Ra.